Shoya leaps from a bridge, and his friends say he's going to kill himself one of these days. Naoka hangs around at Shoya's family salon and teases him. He shoos her away. He sees Shoko for the first time. He finds it odd that she does not acknowledge him. When Naoka teases Shoya, he becomes angry. When Shoko fails to respond, he is intrigued. Her lack of response is the aspect of her character that makes her fascinating to him. Shoya gets beaten up by Genki, but he finds the whole experience hilarious. His attitude towards this event sets the stage for what will happen in the following months between himself and Shoko. Naoka swaps seats with Miyoko so that she can sit beside Shoya, but the two just instantly insult each other. Takeuchi tells Shoko to introduce herself. She doesn't respond. Takeuchi remembers that Shoko is deaf and therefore has not heard him. This theme of the other characters in the book forgetting that Shoko is deaf, forgetting that they can't just talk to her like an able person, will be repeated throughout the series. Upon seeing Shoko's style of communication, Shoya yells, "What a weirdo." Mr. Takeuchi's response is to pick on Shoya. It's an immature move which only exacerbates the situation. He puts the deaf girl directly in front of the troublemaker who will start to bully her. In the salon, Yeiko, Shoko's mother, yells at Shoya's mother. This is our introduction to her, and it establishes her fierce temper. Yeiko storms out. As she is dragging Shoko away like an ill-behaved child, we see Shoko turn and bow politely. In this first scene, we get the sense of a belligerent mother terrorizing her unresisting daughter. Shoya's friends chastise him for his behavior, but they are both smiling as they do so. Later they could make the claim that they expressed their disapproval to Shoya, but this claim would not capture the reality of the mixed signals that they are sending. The kids are trying different levels of shouting to try and discover how deaf Shoko really is. The other kids all join in, but none do so with the same gusto as Shoya, and Shoya is the one who ultimately gets caught by the teacher. Shoya's excuse for his behavior is that he wanted to know how deaf Shoko was. Takeuchi suggests he ask her directly. Shoya is too shy to talk to Shoko because he hardly knows her. He asks Naoka to talk to her instead. Naoka instantly yells across the room at Shoko. Shoko walks across the room and asks Naoka to repeat her question. This scene suggests that Naoka is a much more extroverted personality than Shoya, and it also provides another instance of people forgetting that they can't communicate with Shoko in the conventional manner. We have seen Shoya jumping off bridges and getting into fights, but we have not yet seen him as terrified as this moment when he tries to talk to Shoko. Mr. Takeuchi says, "Some things you just have to deal with." Then over the next few pages we see Takeuchi and the class slowly losing patience with Shoko. I actually have a lot of sympathy for the other students. You don't want a disabled student to feel like they aren't appreciated, but at the same time you have to be realistic about the fact that it won't always be practical to treat them the same as everyone else. Shoko is going to spoil their choir. It's pretty unambiguous at this point that the author feels that this compulsion to include Shoko in everything only exacerbates the situation and isn't likely to benefit Shoko. Shoya finally gets up the nerve to communicate with her. His words are meant spitefully, but they're probably good advice nonetheless. Shoko won't benefit from singing music that she can't hear, and the other students will appreciate her stepping aside for them. Miss Kita wants the class to learn sign language. Shoya thinks sign language sounds like fun. This is a good detail to include, as it makes it more plausible that Shoya would go to the trouble of learning sign language on his own in the intervening years of this volume. Naoka is the student who objects to learning sign language. Mr. Takeuchi is less supportive of the idea than he could be. At this point, the classroom and the teacher seem to be in agreement that the expectation that they learn sign language is an unreasonable one. This is another situation where I feel ambivalent about Mr. Takeuchi's attitude. He could have encouraged the children to learn sign language, which in the long term would have improved Shoko's position in the class, but at the same time I agree that it seems a bit unprofessional to take up school time having one child teach the other children something that neither teacher knows. These characters are trying to navigate between two paths, one which includes Shoko and one which excludes her. I think the author does a good job of showing us that there are no easy answers to this problem, and that there will always be tough decisions and unsatisfactory compromises. Miyoko stands and announces that she will invest a lot of time into studying sign language so that no one else has to. Shoya admires her for this. As with his attitude to learning sign language, Shoya's first response is actually a positive one, but the positivity of his thoughts has no impact on the group because he keeps his thoughts to himself. Before Miyoko spoke, the class was seemingly in accord on the issue of learning sign language, with Naoka acting as the class representative. When Miyoko offers to give up time to help Shoko, she effectively makes the rest of the class seem selfish, and Naoka, as the representative of the class's position, would bear the brunt of this reputational smear. Ms. Kita's round of applause for Miyoko only magnifies this effect. Naoka takes her revenge later that day. She says something mean to Miyoko as she passes by. Naoka stands with her friends, and there are more mean comments spoken, but the speech bubbles have no arrows. This indicates that it doesn't really matter which one of the girls is making the comments, and that this kind of bullying tends to be a group activity, social, yet somewhat anonymous in nature. It's worth contrasting this scene with the bullying that Shoya sustains later in the volume. The girls bully Miyoko with words and not with physical violence. Conversely, Shoya is repeatedly beaten up by his former friends, but the verbal content of their interactions remains superficially friendly. Female bullying appears to be verbal and social in nature, while male bullying appears to be entirely physical in nature. Shoya writes a mean message for Shoko on the blackboard. Once again, we see his other classmates sending him mixed messages about whether or not he should be doing this. Miki says, "Isn't it awful?" but it looks like she's smiling. This is an important scene for Shoko as it underlines her guilt about being a burden to the people around her. Shoko thanks everyone for clearing the unkind comments from the board. There's a sense that her classmates are perplexed, perhaps even repulsed, by her lack of reaction. It is this lack of reaction, this inscrutability that fascinates Shoya, starting from the first time he met her in the salon and continuing on throughout the series. We can contrast this dynamic with the dynamic between Shoya and Naoka. Naoka is very assertive and expressive around Shoya, sparring with him or teasing him or laughing at his pranks, and yet Shoya just seems to find her tiresome. His treatment of Shoko is likened to a boy pouring salt on a slug. There's something oddly endearing about Shoya's mistreatment of Shoko. What he's doing is terrible, but it never seems like his intentions are all that bad. He's just a mischievous kid trying to amuse himself, who doesn't entirely understand the broader ramifications of what he's doing. Miki once again chastises Shoya whilst smiling. The next thing she does is tell on him to Mr. Takeuchi. The class are indoors, having a laugh at Shoko's expense, while she works alone outside. This is the moment in this volume that most clearly expresses Shoko's social isolation and her exclusion from this social group. Someone, probably Naoka, pulls out one of Shoko's hearing aids. Shoya yanks out her other hearing aid. Mr. Takeuchi witnesses this, but misses the fact that Shoya was not the person who pulled out the first hearing aid. Mr. Takeuchi's response this time is definitely too weak. He simply says, "It's your responsibility, don't embarrass me, and I understand how you feel." He basically condones Shoya's behavior. Shoya comes away from the meeting thinking that he isn't even required to apologize. Shoya expects Shoko will ask him to apologize, but instead she writes, "I'm sorry." This just seems to make him angry. Shoko reaches out and clasps his hand. This is an obvious tactical error on her part. Her hope is that she can convince him to regard her as a friend and be nicer to her, but she goes about it in a way that just embarrasses him in front of his friends. Unsurprisingly, Shoya's response is to double down on his mean behavior so that he can save face and look tough. She does the sign for "Can we be friends?" but Shoya doesn't understand. In a sense, Naoka is to blame for this gap in their communication due to her earlier objection to learning sign language. Shoya throws her communication notebook into the pond. She goes in and fishes round for it, but doesn't find it. Several of her hearing aids are destroyed by Shoya. I like the ritual burial. We now jump ahead to 5 months after the first incident with the hearing aid. 8 of her hearing aids have been damaged or gone missing. Clearly a lot of people are complicit in this situation. Shoya is primarily responsible. His classmates have collaborated with him to one degree or another. Shoko has put up no fight whatsoever. Mr. Takeuchi has done little to correct Shoya's behaviour. Shoko's mother has allowed this situation to continue for months before alerting the school. Clearly there is a communal sense that this is all someone else's responsibility, and no one seems to be willing to be the one to stand up and put a stop to it. Takeuchi yells at Shoya before he can confess. This begins the social policy of ostracizing and scapegoating Shoya, making it seem like no one else was complicit in the bullying. Shoya is persona non grata. He finds himself in the fish pond. He discovers Shoko's communication book, still there from when he tossed it in 5 months ago. Shoya flips through her book. The messages progress from friendly and helpful to impatient to insulting. Beneath each surly message, Shoko has simply written, "I'm sorry," over and over. Mr. Takeuchi asks why Shoya is in the pond. Shoya says his friend pushed him in. Mr. Takeuchi doesn't believe him. Once again, bullying persists with the victim in a state of isolation, surrounded by adults who aren't aware or aren't interested. Shoya's mother asks him why he's wet. This time, perhaps because Mr. Takeuchi didn't believe him, Shoya does not tell his mother what happened. Shoya's mother says, "You are so pathetic." This is perhaps the only time that we see her genuinely angry with him. She withdraws 1.7 million yen, which is the amount that the destroyed hearing aids cost. Shoya's mother wants him to apologize. Yeiko tells her that Shoko isn't there. His mother tells him, "You will apologize before we go home." This becomes an important theme in the story. Takeuchi failed to make Shoya apologize, and he misses this opportunity too. He won't get round to properly apologizing for his behavior until much later in the series. It turns out that Shoko is just around the corner, waiting for her mother. Shoko smiles at Shoya. It seems to me that Yeiko lied about Shoko not being there, and has made the conscious decision not to allow Shoya the opportunity to be forgiven for his transgressions. At this point in the story, Shoya seems to be completely unfazed by everything that's happened. He shows no signs of remorse. It will take years of suffering the consequences of his actions for his guilt to become overwhelming. He still has no intention of being nice to her. Now Shoko and Shoya are both pariahs. They are partnered for an exercise class because no one else will be their partner. Shoya decides to run off school premises rather than be her partner. Shoko is still being bullied. Someone, my guess is Naoka, has been writing abusive messages in her textbook. Someone has been soiling Shoko's shoes. We later discover that it is Naoka because she sees Shoko cleaning Shoya's desk and assumes this means that Shoko likes Shoya. Naoka now has jealousy as her motivation for bullying Shoko. This is arguably the most important frame of the entire series. Earlier in the book, Mr. Takeuchi said, "It's your responsibility." When he repeats this line a second time, the phrase becomes a sort of mantra that burrows deep into Shoya and shapes his whole personality for the years to come. Takeuchi makes the connection between Shoya's past sins and what is happening in his life today. Before, the words seemed abstract. He seemed to be speaking of responsibility in the mundane sense, in the way that teachers use the word when handing out detention slips. Now the words have a karmic quality. He's effectively saying, the bullies aren't responsible for your suffering. You're responsible because you brought this on yourself. This scene sets the stage for the guilt that will completely encompass Shoya's life for the next 5 years. Shoya sees Shoko cleaning graffiti off her desk and assumes that she is still being bullied. He thinks, keeping quiet's not going to change anything, you gotta fight like me. But then he gets beaten up by his friends. Perhaps it doesn't really matter how you respond to being bullied. Shoya criticizes Shoko for not saying what she feels, but when she does express herself, he can't understand what she's saying. When Shoya graduates to middle school, Kazuki makes sure to tell everyone what Shoya did, ensuring that he can never escape his past. This contributes to, but is certainly not the sole reason for, Shoya's subsequent years of social isolation. We now see a series of frames where Shoya attributes very negative and judgmental inner monologues to the people around him. Most of these interactions seem pretty neutral. Shoya is projecting the worst possible motivations onto perfectly innocent social interactions. None of these characters have eyes, which indicates Shoya's inability to look people in the eye. This is the precursor to the crosses that will appear over the faces of nearly every person he encounters. Shoya's unexpressed assessments of his peers seem to be every bit as uncharitable as their unspoken assessment of him. He accuses Miki of pretending that she has integrity. In her case, I'm inclined to regard the criticism as valid. Shoya despises the girls for pretending that they are highly sought after. Interestingly, Naoki used to do this to him to attract his attention, but he was too dense to realize it. Shoya buys a book about sign language. The fact that he actually learns sign language rather than simply explaining himself to Shoko with a letter suggests that, at the back of his mind, he is hoping that they will become friends. Shoya foresees a future of loneliness, mediocrity, drudgery, grief, poverty, frailty, and sickness. It's clearly a nightmare vision of a human life, and one constructed by a mind that is either intentionally selecting or is only capable of selecting the most negative possible elements. Shoya, intending to end his life, takes the somewhat theatrical step of tearing off the bottom half of his calendar. Shoya has been working and saving money for years. He quits his job, sells his belongings, and places 1.7 million yen beside his sleeping mother. Shoya sees Shoko for the first time in 5 years and is surprised to discover that he is crying. This establishes a theme of Shoya being an emotionally repressed person who is unaware of his emotional state, occasionally exploding with anger or finding that he's crying and not being able to explain why.